He pulled the dog out of the ditch with one hand and held his flashlight with the other. And the whole time the animal didn't make a single sound. That was what stayed with Callum, not the cold, not the blood matted along the dog's left shoulder, not the way the headlights of his truck cut through the November dark along the Trans-Canada outside Kenora. It was the silence. A dog that hurt that bad should have been screaming. He almost hadn't stopped. That was the truth of it, the part he'd turn over later in the quiet of the house, when there was nothing but the sound of the wood stove and his own breathing. He'd seen the shape in the ditch from a distance, and his first instinct, 12 years of instinct, built into muscle and nerve, had been to keep moving. Don't stop for shapes in the dark. Don't stop for things that don't make noise. But he wasn't that man anymore, or he was trying not to be. He wrapped the dog in the old wool blanket he kept behind the seat. The one Judith had put there 6 winters ago. The one he hadn't washed because it still smelled faintly like the cedar chest in their bedroom. And he drove the 40 minutes back to Dryden without the radio on. Callum Aldred had bought the property outside Dryden 3 years ago, 2 months after the funeral. 1 month after his last session with the Veterans Affairs counselor in Thunder Bay, who'd told him, carefully and without looking directly at him, that he might benefit from a change of environment. He'd taken that to mean, go somewhere else and figure it out. He'd driven north until the highway got thin and the trees got close, and there was a property listing on his phone for 11 acres, with a 2-bedroom house and a collapsed barn and a well that needed work. He'd bought it in cash. He hadn't told his sister where he was going for the first 6 weeks. He was 53 years old. He had a Navy Cross he kept in a sock drawer. He had a left knee that predicted rain better than any weather app, a complement of shrapnel scars along his right forearm, and a recurring dream about a rocky beach, in a country he was no longer cleared to name. He had a drip coffee maker, a chest freezer full of venison, and a subscription to a seed catalog he read cover to cover every January. He did not have a dog. He had not planned to have a dog. The vet in Kenora, a woman named Dr. Solberg who had kind eyes and the efficient hands of someone who'd been doing this for 30 years, looked at the animal on her table and then looked at Callum and said, "You know this is going to cost you." "I know," Callum said. "He's been out there a while. That shoulder wound is infected. 2 of his back toenails are torn down to the quick. He's severely dehydrated and he's running a fever. Will he make it?" Dr. Solberg pressed her stethoscope to the dog's chest and listened. The dog lay perfectly still. He was a medium-sized shepherd mix, mostly black with tan markings above the eyes and along the jaw, the kind of face that looked permanently worried. He was watching the ceiling with an expression of absolute detachment, as if whatever happened to his body from here on out was simply no longer his concern. "He's a fighter," she said. "You can see it in how he's breathing. He's not giving up." She looked up. "Are you?" Callum wasn't sure if she was asking about the dog or about him. He said, "No." She gave the dog IV fluids and antibiotics and cleaned and dressed the shoulder and let Callum sit in the waiting room on a plastic chair until just past 2 in the morning, when she came out and said he'd stabilized, and Callum could take him home in the morning. She handed him a sheaf of discharge papers and a list of medications and the name of a specialist in Thunder Bay if the infection didn't respond. Callum slept in his truck in the parking lot. He didn't go home. In the morning, the dog was sitting up. He didn't wag his tail when Callum came in. He didn't come forward. He sat on the examination table with the cone around his neck and his bandaged shoulder and his worried eyebrows. And he looked at Callum the way Callum had been looked at by a lot of people in his life, with extreme caution and the readiness to bolt if necessary. Callum pulled a plastic chair over and sat down at eye level. He didn't reach out. He just sat. "I don't know your name," he said. "I don't know where you came from. You don't know me either, so we're even." The dog didn't look away. He had dark amber eyes, almost copper, and they were very steady, watchful. Callum had spent a long time around men who'd learned to look at the world that way, constantly scanning, never fully at rest, and he recognized it immediately. "I've got 11 acres, Callum said. "Wood stove. Decent well, finally." He paused. "It's quiet. You'd probably be all right with quiet." The dog blinked once, slowly. Then he lay down on the table and put his chin on his paws and kept his eyes on Callum. Callum stayed for an hour. Nobody talked. He named him Drift. not for any particular reason he could articulate, except that it felt right. Something about the way the dog had appeared out of the dark. No collar, no chip, no history that anyone could trace. Drift. Something that had come loose from wherever it had been fixed and ended up here. Callum knew something about that. He set up a bed in the corner of the kitchen, near the wood stove but not too close, and he put a bowl of water down and a bowl of food, and he let Drift decide what he wanted to do with it. For the first 2 days, Drift mostly slept. He ate carefully, without enthusiasm, the way a dog eats when it doesn't entirely trust that the food will keep coming. He went outside to do what he needed to do, and he came back in and he lay down, and he watched Callum with those copper eyes from across whatever room Callum happened to be in. He didn't bark, not once. Callum's neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Eustace, who lived 4 kilometers down the road and appeared at intervals with baked goods and unrequested opinions, stopped by on the 3rd day and peered at Drift through the screen door. "That's a quiet dog," Eustace said. "Yes," Callum said. "My Agnes barked from the day I brought her home until the day she died. 17 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I still hear it sometimes." Callum opened the screen door and let him in. He put the kettle on. Eustace set a foil-wrapped loaf of banana bread on the counter and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Drift, who looked back at him from his corner bed without moving. "What happened to his shoulder?" Eustace asked. "Don't know. He was in the ditch outside Kenora when I found him." Eustace picked at the edge of the foil. "Must have been someone's dog once. Shepherd mix like that doesn't go feral on his own. Someone lost him or—" He stopped. He didn't say the other option. "Yeah," Callum said. "Well, he's here now." Eustace looked at Callum with the particular directness of a man who'd spent 40 years looking at teenagers who thought they could hide what they were feeling. "So are you?" Callum poured the tea and didn't answer. But he didn't disagree. Judith had been gone for 4 years. She'd died on a Tuesday in March, which had always struck Callum as a terrible day for anything important to happen. Too far from the weekend in either direction, too gray, too ordinary. She'd been driving home from the library in Thunder Bay, where she volunteered every 2nd week, sorting the large print returns and recommending mysteries to the patrons, who came in looking uncertain. A transport truck ran a red light on a slick road. She was 51 years old, and she had been the person who knew how to talk to Callum when nobody else could find the door. He had not done well after. That was the honest way to say it. He had not done well. He'd gotten through the first year on muscle memory alone. The habits of discipline built into him by 2 decades in the Navy, by Bud SH training and deployment, and the particular grinding work of learning to keep functioning when everything inside you is screaming to stop. You kept going because stopping wasn't an option. You kept going because the men beside you needed you to. But there were no men beside him anymore. There was just the house in Thunder Bay that had her reading lamp still on the end table and her handwriting on the grocery list on the fridge. He'd sold the house in Thunder Bay. He'd come north. And then one November night on an empty highway, a dog had appeared in a ditch, and he'd stopped the truck, and here they were. Drift's shoulder healed slowly. Dr. Solberg had warned him it would. The infection had been stubborn. She'd had to switch antibiotics twice. And even once the wound closed, the muscle underneath was stiff and guarded. And Drift walked with a slight hitch for weeks, favoring the right side without seeming to be aware he was doing it. Callum understood that too. He didn't push the dog. He let Drift set the pace for everything. When they walked, how far, where they went, whether Drift wanted to be close or wanted to be across the room. Some mornings Drift would follow him from room to room, a quiet shadow at about 3 feet of distance, close enough to observe but not close enough to touch. Other mornings he'd stay in his corner bed until noon, and Callum would hear him shift and sigh and go back to sleep, and he'd leave a bowl of food near the bed and get on with his day. He'd started to notice, around the 3rd week, that Drift had opinions. Not expressed loudly. He still didn't bark, but there was a vocabulary in his body. In the angle of his ears and the tilt of his head, and the particular way he'd go still when something in the world didn't sit right with him, that Callum found himself learning the way he'd once learned to read terrain. Where's the high ground? Where's the cover? What's that movement on the ridge? The first time he understood what Drift was telling him, it was about the firewood. Callum had stacked the east side of the woodpile without re-splitting the larger rounds. He'd been tired, and he'd told himself he'd deal with them later. And one afternoon he was carrying an armload inside, and Drift appeared in the doorway of the shed and sat down and stared at the poorly split rounds with an expression of measured disapproval. Callum put down the armload. He looked at the rounds. He looked at Drift. "I know," he said. He went and got them all. Drift watched him work through 6 of them, then walked back to the apparently. Callum found himself almost smiling, the unfamiliar sensation of it, like a muscle that had been unused for a long time. Eustace came back every week or so. He always had something, butter tarts, a jar of pickles he'd made himself, once a paperback mystery novel he pressed on Callum with the firmness of a prescription being handed to a patient who was known to be non-compliant. "My late wife used to love this series," Eustace said. "It's set in the Maritimes. You don't have to tell me you'll read it, just put it on the shelf, and one day you'll be out of things to do and you'll pick it up." "I'm never out of things to do," Callum said. "You know what I mean." Drift had, by the 6th week, decided that Eustace was acceptable. He would come and sit near the old man's chair. Not close enough to be petted without consent, but close enough to indicate tolerance. Eustace, to his credit, never pushed it. He'd sit and talk and drink his tea, and sometimes his hand would drift down to his knee and hover there, and Drift would watch it, and eventually, on an afternoon in early January, Drift shifted 2 inches to the left, and Eustace's hand settled gently on the back of his neck. Nobody said anything about it, but later, after Eustace had gone home, Callum sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while, and thought about the fact that it was the first time, since he'd found Drift in the ditch, that the dog had let anyone touch him. He thought about how long it had taken. He thought about the patience of it. He thought about his own counselor in Thunder Bay, the one who'd told him to change his environment, and he thought about how many sessions had gone by before Callum had said anything true. 6. He'd counted. 6 sessions of talking around the actual thing, describing the weather and the logistics and the practical facts of grief, before he'd sat down one Tuesday afternoon, a Tuesday again, always Tuesdays, and said, "I don't know who I am when I'm not in the service of something. She was the thing I was in service to, and now I don't know what I'm for." 6 sessions for a man to let another person close enough to hear the real thing. 6 weeks for a dog. Callum supposed that was about right. In February it happened. He hadn't been having a good week. The dreams had come back, not the beach dream but a different one. Older, from the deployment to the Gulf that he never talked about, involving a compound and a decision, and a teammate named Petty Officer Gareth Neild, who had been 27 years old, and who had a wife in Halifax and a daughter he'd never met because his daughter was born 6 weeks after he came home in a flag-draped case. The dreams didn't replay it wrong. That was the worst part. They replayed it exactly right. He'd been awake since 3. It was 5:30 and he was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold, looking at the window that showed him nothing but his own reflection and the dark behind it. Drift got up from his bed. This was unusual. Drift had learned Callum's rhythms precisely, and he knew that this particular sitting in the dark before dawn was a solitary thing, a thing that needed space around it. He had always, until now, respected that. He walked to the table. He sat down next to Callum's chair, on the left side, close enough that his shoulder was against Callum's knee. He looked at the dark window, too. He didn't make a sound. He didn't try to fix anything. He just put himself there, solid and warm and present, and he stayed. Callum put his hand on the dog's head. He sat there for a long time. The window went from black to deep gray to the thin white blue of a February dawn over the boreal forest, and the whole time neither of them moved, just the sound of the wood stove, and the wind off the lake, and the quiet, steady breathing of a dog who'd been broken and put back together, and had, somewhere in that process, learned something about what another broken thing needed. When it was fully light, Callum got up and made fresh coffee and gave Drift his breakfast and stood at the window, looking at the 11 acres of snow-covered birch and spruce and frozen ground and thought, "All right, okay, I'm still here." Spring came the way it always comes in northwestern Ontario, grudgingly, in stages, with several false starts that would raise your hopes and then dump 8 centimeters of wet snow on them just to make sure you understood that this was not a place for optimism. But it came. The ice on the lake went out in April with a sound like distant cannon fire. A cracking and shifting that Drift stood on the shore and watched with total fascination, head tilted to one side, ears forward, utterly riveted. "First time you've heard that?" Callum asked. Drift looked at him briefly, then back at the lake. The ice groaned and split, and a long gray slab tilted and slid, and the open water beneath it was black and very cold and shining. "Yeah," Callum said. "It gets me too." He'd started talking to Drift out loud, he'd noticed. Not in the way people sometimes did with pets, narrating their own actions or making the dog a stand-in audience for their thoughts. This was different. It was more like consulting, running things past someone who wouldn't offer an opinion, but whose presence meant he had to put the thought into actual words, out into the air, where he could hear what it sounded like. It had occurred to him, around that same time, that he hadn't done that with another living thing since Judith. Judith had been the one he'd run things past. Not decisions, exactly. He'd always been capable of making decisions. That was never the problem. It was the thinking before the decision, the out-loud working of it. She'd sit at the kitchen table with her tea, and he'd pace and talk, and she wouldn't tell him what to do. She'd just listen with that particular quality of attention she had. Fully there, not waiting for her turn to speak, actually receiving what he was saying. He'd never found anyone else who could do that. He hadn't looked for anyone else who could do that. He hadn't understood until now, standing on the shore of a lake in April, watching the ice go out with a dog at his knee, that he'd been doing it all wrong. Not looking for it in people. Not letting people close enough to offer it. The house in Thunder Bay with the reading lamp, the move north, the isolation dressed up as self-sufficiency. The dog pressed against his leg. Callum looked down at him. "I know," he said. "I know." His sister Moira called on a Sunday in May. Moira was 56, and she had the family bluntness without the family reticence, which meant she said exactly what she thought, but she thought it loudly and without apology. She'd called every 2 weeks since he'd moved to Dryden, and he'd answered maybe half of those calls, and she'd never stopped calling. "There's a dog barking," she said. "That's Drift. Who's Drift, my dog?" A pause. "You have a dog?" "I have a dog, Callum Aldred," she said. "I have been trying to get you to adopt a dog for 6 years. I know. You told me, and I'm quoting here, I don't want the responsibility. I know, and now you have a dog." He sort of showed up. Another pause longer. He could hear her recalibrating. "How are you?" she said, and her voice had shifted. The bluntness was still there, but the edge had come off it, and underneath it was the thing she'd been asking every 2 weeks for 3 years. The thing she'd never quite been able to get a straight answer to. He thought about February, the table, the window going from black to gray to blue-white, Drift's shoulder against his knee. "Better," he said. "Actually better." Moira was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. Can I come up?" "When?" "Victoria Day weekend." He looked at Drift, who was sitting by the screen door, looking out at the yard with the focused attention of a dog who has decided that the squirrel situation requires monitoring. "Yeah," Callum said. "Come up." She arrived on the Friday with a car full of groceries, her husband Terence, and the particular energy of someone who has been worried about a person for a long time, and is releasing that worry in the form of cooking. She made a pot of moose chili from a recipe she'd gotten from a woman in Sioux Lookout. She'd already made friends in Sioux Lookout. Somehow, she always made friends everywhere. And she fed Eustace, who appeared as if summoned by the smell of it, and she sat across the table from Callum and looked at him with those assessing eyes that had been looking at him since he was 8 years old. "You look like yourself," she said. "What did I look like before?" "Like someone wearing you as a costume." She spooned chili into his bowl. It was unsettling. Terence laughed from across the table. He was a quiet man who'd long since learned that the role of Moira's husband was to be present and supportive, and occasionally to say the thing she was thinking but had decided was too blunt even for her. He'd been good for Callum in the way that a second anchor point was good for a rope bridge. Not the thing you were climbing toward, but the thing that kept the structure sound. Drift had accepted Moira in under 10 minutes. He'd sniffed her shoes, looked up at her face, and walked back to his mat by the door with the air of someone who had completed assessment and was satisfied with the findings. Moira had looked at Callum and mouthed, "I love him." Later, after supper, Eustace and Terence had gone out to look at the property, and Moira and Callum sat on the porch with cups of tea, and the long northern evening still fully bright at 8 o'clock, the light going gold and horizontal through the birch trees. "Tell me about him," Moira said. "Drift," Callum told her. "The highway, the ditch, the silence. Dr. Solberg, the cone, the copper eyes, the weeks of careful distance, and the vocabulary he'd learned to read, the woodpile. February, he told her about February. When he was done, Moira was quiet for a while. A loon called from somewhere out on the lake, twice, the sound carrying perfectly in the still air. You know what Mum used to say, Moira said, about people who are very broken. She had a lot of opinions about a lot of things. She said that very broken people don't heal in groups. They heal in pairs. They need one other thing, one person, one place, one animal, to attach to first before they can attach to anything else. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She was right about most things, Mum. Callum looked at Drift, who was lying on the porch boards at his feet, chin on paws, watching the birch trees. Yeah, he said, she was. The summer was the best one he could remember in a long time, not because anything dramatic happened. The opposite, really. It was the ordinary things. The way the mornings came earlier and earlier until the light was already there. When he opened his eyes, the sound of the water, and the birds and Drift snails on the floorboards as he did his morning circuit of the house. The garden Callum had put in along the south side of the house, his first attempt, producing actual tomatoes that he was unreasonably proud of. Eustace stopping by on Thursdays with his thermos of coffee and staying 2 hours and talking about everything. The town, the weather, his late wife Agnes who'd barked continuously for 17 years, the particular joy of winter tires put on early, the calls with Moira on Sundays, more of which he answered now. Drift had started to bark. It had happened gradually, without announcement. A single bark one morning at a raven that had gotten too familiar with the compost. A short 2-bark sequence at the truck when Callum revved the engine unexpectedly. And then one Tuesday afternoon in July, Callum had begun to think of Tuesdays differently now, to reclaim them. A full volley of sharp, clear barks at the end of the driveway where a bear had appeared from the tree line. A young one, curious and too close. Callum came out of the house at the sound of it, and Drift was standing between him and the bear, 12 meters away, not moving forward but not giving ground either. Just barking with a steady, deliberate authority that said, "You know better than this." The bear looked at Drift for a moment. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. Drift watched it go. Then he turned around and looked at Callum, and for the first time he wagged his tail. A slow, dignified wag once, twice, as if to say, "Handled." Callum stood there for a moment, on the porch of his house on 11 acres of northern Ontario. In July, the light heavy and golden, and the smell of the lake and the forest everywhere around him, and he laughed. Not a polite laugh or a performed laugh, but the real kind. The kind that came from somewhere low in the chest, the kind he hadn't heard come out of himself in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Drift trotted up the porch steps and went inside, apparently done with the moment. And Callum stood there a little longer, letting it settle. Eustace had a granddaughter named Piper, 22, studying environmental science in Sudbury, who came to visit in August and ended up spending 3 weeks instead of 1 because she'd started a community mapping project with the local Métis Nation Council, and she needed to be on the land. She was small and determined and did not adjust her opinions for anyone, and she and Callum got along immediately in the way that sometimes happens between people who both prefer directness and are reliably suspicious of charm. She'd grown up hearing about the Navy man up the road, she told him. "What did your grandfather say about me?" Callum asked. "That you were quiet and good with your hands and probably carrying more than you let on, but that you'd be all right." She looked at him across the table. He was right. She'd spent a lot of time with Drift. They had a particular rapport. She'd sit cross-legged on the porch floor, and Drift would come and put his chin on her knee, and she'd scratch behind his ears with the focused attention of someone giving the matter full consideration. And he'd make a sound that Callum had never heard before. A low, soft, continuous sound, somewhere between a groan and a hum, that he could only interpret as contentment. "He doesn't do that with everyone," Eustace observed. "He does it with the right people," Piper said. She stayed until the end of August. On her last morning, she loaded her truck in the early gray before sunrise, and Drift sat at the end of the driveway and watched her go, and then turned and came back to the house and lay down in his bed with the specific heaviness of a dog processing a loss. Callum sat on the floor next to him. "She'll be back," he said. "People like that come back." Drift looked at him. His ears were back and his eyes were soft, and he didn't look entirely convinced, but he leaned his head against Callum's arm, and Callum sat there until the sun was fully up. It was Eustace who said it. In the end, October, and the birch trees were doing what they did in October, which was turning the whole world gold and yellow, and setting it briefly, almost unbearably, on fire before letting it go. Eustace had come by on a Thursday with butter tarts, and they were sitting on the porch, watching Drift make his way through the fallen leaves along the fence line, nose down, reading the autumn in the way that dogs read things, completely, unhurriedly, with full attention to everything the ground had to say. "He's different from when you found him," Eustace said. "Yes," Callum said. "You both are." Callum held his coffee mug in both hands. It was cold enough now that he could see his breath, thin and white, curling away into the still air. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose so." Eustace watched Drift move along the fence, stopping occasionally to consider something in the leaves with the gravity of a judge reviewing evidence. "My Agnes," he said. "She used to bark at the dark. Every night, when the sun went down. I thought it was a bad habit and I tried to train her out of it." He paused. "Took me 10 years to understand she was just announcing herself, saying, 'I'm here, I'm still here.'" Drift had reached the far corner of the fence. He stopped, looked back at the porch, looked at Callum. Then he lifted his head and let out a single clear bark into the October air, not at anything in particular. "Just that, present, accounted for, here." Callum raised his coffee mug in his direction. "I hear you," he said, and in the silence afterward, the particular deep silence of northern Ontario in October, all wood smoke and distance and smell of cold coming, something that had been very tightly held for a very long time let go a little more. Not all at once, not with any drama, just a slow, quiet release, the way ice goes at the edges of a lake, the way a door opens that has been locked for a long time, not broken open, but simply unlocked, by patience, by time, by the steady presence of one animal who had needed to be found, and one man who had needed, without knowing it, to find him.